Learning to wear a mask, that word already embedded in the term masculinity, is the first lesson in patriarchal masculinity that a boy learns. He learns that his core feelings cannot be expressed if they don't conform to the acceptable behaviors sexism defines as male. Asked to give up the true self in order to realize the patriarchal ideal, boys learn self betrayal early and are rewarded for these acts of soul murder. Hi, everybody. Once again, this is Professor Parks for COMM 493 Gaming and Relationships. This is going to be the first lecture using individual video games to explore some different course themes and concepts. The title of this lecture is Reimagining Healthy Masculinity Through God of War. Or, alternative title, Daddy Issues. Daddy Issues everywhere. It's been pointed out to me when I first started putting this class together by my wife in particular that a lot of the things I was talking about or wanting to talk about in this class, a lot of the games I wanted to talk about had the theme of daddy issues in them. A lot of them were games about dads or father figures. And as I've mentioned, I think in an earlier lecture, part of my inspiration for this class was becoming a parent myself. So I am a parent. I'm a father. I have one son. His name is Leo, and he's great. And when my wife was pregnant with him, I found myself playing certain video games. I was playing some of these games like God of War, which has a very strong father-son relationship. I was playing games like that, playing games like The Last of Us with Joel and Ellie, and other ones that were really making me kind of think and reflect on what does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good man, to be a good father, etc. And that's part of it's part of what made me start to find gaming to be such an interesting medium. So daddy issues could be a subtitle for this. I see three questions as guiding today's lecture. Three questions that are interrelated that I want to try to answer with everything that I'm going to be talking about today. So, first question is, what is the problem of masculinity in modern culture? What do we mean by that? And what is the problem with how we try to talk about gender and masculinity right now? The second problem is, how is masculinity something that's created through culture? How is gender, in particular masculinity, how is it culturally negotiated? Our understanding of it, how we perceive it, how we experience it. And then, of course, the third question is going to be, well, how does this video game series, God of War, engage the question of how can men be better and how can parent-child relationships also be better? So to do that, to answer those questions, here's everything I'm going to be going over. We'll start by defining key terms and talking about that cultural problem of gender and masculinity and how we talk about it. Within that, I'm going to review some key concepts. I'm going to lay some groundwork for you to be able to understand the type of gender analysis I'm going to do of this video game. And we'll go over some key ideas like the crisis of masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, and the theory of gender role stress and conflict. And then, of course, we're going to apply some of those ideas to God of War. And I want to illustrate a few things that I see happening in those video games related to gender and masculinity. For example, the idea of someone's identity or masculinity being destined, the idea of restrictive emotionality. I'm going to pull in relational dialectics theory, which is a core interpersonal communication theory, and also this concept of ludonarrativity, which is all about how the stories of video games can interact with the actual gameplay and mechanics of a video game, how they can either complement each other or contradict each other in interesting ways. So once we go over all that, the last point I'll go over is your first essay for this class, which is going to involve you writing about some sort of video game that asks us to reimagine a certain type of relationship. And I'm hoping that this lecture on God of War and masculinity and parent-child relationships will give you some sort of model for that. Will give you some inspiration to be able to do that for yourself. So now that you know what I'm going to cover, let's dive into defining some key terms. I designed this class with the idea that people from different students from different experience levels would be taking this. So the expectation, some of you might be seniors, the expectation, some of you might be younger, might be even freshmen or sophomores. So because of that, I don't want to assume that everybody has had exposure to gender studies or has taken a class where they've talking about some of these key terms. So let me go over just some really basics. When it comes to this type of analysis that I'm going to do, thinking about gender and culture, it's important to distinguish between the term sex and the term gender. So, sex refers to biological and physiological characteristics that define who we are, that define men and women. That's talking about our bodies, our chromosomes, our genetics, hormone levels, all those types of things, and how they affect and influence who we are and our personalities, our behavior. However, gender is, we can define gender as the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for people, considers appropriate for men and women. Another way of kind of separating those two terms out, and a way you might be familiar with, is the idea of the nature nurture debate, or I like to think of it better as the nature nurture conversation, dialogue. So on the one side, the idea would be that, okay, well, someone's gender, someone's identity, that's completely a product of nature. It's completely product of your biology. Your genetics determine who you are. Your personality traits, that's inherent to who you are. And then the other side of that would be, well, what about the role of nurture? What about the role of culture? What about the role of not just what chromosomes you have or what your genetics are, but what you're taught growing up by your family about what is the proper way to be a man or to be a woman, or what you're taught in school, or what sorts of media representation you see of people of different gender identities. In other words, it's not just what you're born as physically, but what you're enculturated and nurtured to believe about yourself. And so, as you can see, one side of things, the side of nature, can lean towards who you are. You really don't have any control over it. You're influenced by these things like your genetics, and so you don't really have a say in that. The other side of things, though, this nurture side of things, can suggest that actually, to some extent, we do have a say. We do have agency over how we understand ourselves and what our gender means to us and how we want to present ourselves to the world and interact with other people. Now, I think both of these schools of thought, which represent, of course, all sorts of different academic disciplines and perspectives on this, I think they can both be very valuable. However, my perspective in this lecture today is definitely going to lean more towards the nurture side of things, and more on how we are taught about gender, how we communicate about it, the different story lines we have about what it means to be a man or a woman. However, I do like to stress that anytime you have a topic like this, you could take the same topic related to gender and come at it from those two very different schools of thought, and they both be very illuminating, both be very valuable. So, for example, two books that come to mind for me on the same or a similar topic are, one book is called T, The Story of Testosterone, the hormone that dominates and divides us, which is by a biologist, Carol Hooven. She is a biologist at Harvard. Well, that's a book that very much is about the science of testosterone and hormones and how that affects human behavior and interaction. And then on the flip side, from more of a rhetoric perspective, communication perspective, which is my background, my expertise, was another book called From Hysteria to Hormones, A Rhetorical History. So this is a book by a scholar named Amy Kerber, which tackles a similar topic, which is the history of how people have thought about women and women's bodies, all the way back from hysteria, all the way up to the discovery of hormones in the 20th century. But instead of from a scientific perspective and biological perspective, more from that communication standpoint. What are the different ideas people have had throughout history about women and their bodies, and how have people argued about those? How have some of those stories changed or not changed throughout history? All right, so now that we've defined some of those key terms, you know that we're focused more on gender and masculinity as a communication and culture process. So, how we understand those things is coming about through how we talk about them. The next point that I want to hit on then is thinking about masculinity as a problem, the problem of masculinity. So, what does this mean? According to Tim Lomas, who wrote one of the two scholarly articles you were required to read this week, he puts it this way. He talks about in his article about men as a group in society being damaged and or damaged doing. And that has a couple different meanings to it. So, on the one hand, what that phrase can mean is the problems men themselves are experiencing. For example, men over the past several decades in the United States are suffering worse education and health outcomes. For the past several decades, boys in school are not doing as well as girls. A lot of times they are not completing high school, not going to college, not earning degrees, and when they are in school, not doing as well in terms of the grades that they earn. And also, men face a lot of health problems, sometimes uniquely as a group. So, dying more often and dying and not living to be as old as women, for example. However, to cite some other research from a researcher named Richard Reeves, I think it's important to highlight that women still face a lot of different challenges in society because sometimes reactionary groups, for example, in the manosphere or other men's rights groups, sometimes they'll cherry pick certain data points, like some of those things I just mentioned, like how men are doing in school or health outcomes. And sometimes they'll use those data points to frame this as, oh, see, society is attacking men, and men are the one group uniquely under attack by society and having problems. And that's very far from the truth. So, according to Richard Reeves, who wrote a book called Of Boys and Men, he claims or he argues that we have an interesting situation in society right now, at least in American society, where we have an education system that you can argue favors girls, or not favors girls, but boys aren't doing as well in. However, at the same time that we have an education system where boys are falling behind, we still have an economy and an overall workforce where women are not doing as well. So there's still ongoing issues with gender pay gaps, women being paid less for doing the same work, or women not receiving as much mentorship as men do on average in their careers, that sort of thing. So I just like to point that out because this is such a culturally charged topic when it comes to talking about it. So that's one meaning of saying the problem of men is okay, well, men are dealing with a lot of problems as a group. The other meaning of that could be the problems that men inflict on average as a group on other people. So men overwhelmingly commit the majority of violence in society, of violent acts, whether that's towards other men and also, of course, towards women and people who are more marginalized. That's why Tim Lomas in that article was developing this concept of what he calls critical positive masculinity, which is basically saying, okay, how can we try to help men? How can we have the conversation of imagining a healthier version of masculinity, of being a man? How can we help men be happier and healthier and at the same time pay attention to and empathize with the ongoing needs of women and the ongoing needs and issues of people who are more marginalized, of all the different types of people in society that don't necessarily live up to or don't align with the ideals of hegemonic masculinity, as we will get into that. So another layer of the problem of masculinity then is the cultural backlash to it. Again, how people can be and how people are very polarized on this issue. So on the one hand, we have a cultural attitude which kind of cringes, I think, at this, even this phrase of toxic masculinity, and disagrees with it and says, no, that's a myth. Toxic masculinity, this is a bad idea. This is something that is it's a misrepresentation of uh what this group of people are viewing as positive things with traditional masculinity. And the problem with this can be kind of a dismissal of the behaviors that get associated with toxic masculinity. People who use that term, toxic masculinity. And to be honest, I have my own sort of critique of that term. I'm not going to get into right now. I have problems with it for different reasons than a lot of the people who complain about the term. But the problem with this is that it can dismiss the very real concerns that people who talk about toxic masculinity have. Like, well, look at how, these really strict ideas of being a man can negatively harm people, whether it's men themselves or negatively harm the other people in their lives. And so, because of that, that can lead to this dismissal of any conversation about trying to develop a healthier masculinity. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there's another cultural attitude towards this entire conversation, this entire discourse, which says, well, why are we even talking about men? Why are we even talking about men's issues? Aren't men still so privileged in so many different ways in society? Why are we centering them to be the group of people that need to be talked about when women and queer communities and so many other people are facing more issues? And I really like this quote from Richard Reeves because I think it captures his perspective, his answer to that question. So according to Richard Reeves, one of the reasons people are reluctant to talk about these real issues with boys and men is because they think it will somehow distract from or diminish the ongoing need to work on the issues of women and girls. And he says people can care about more than one thing. And I really like this perspective that he has in this book that he wrote of Boys and Men, which basically says, look, we could have two conversations at once, which is how can we rethink masculinity in a healthier way culturally at the same time? How can we do that in a way that doesn't scapegoat women or doesn't scapegoat people who are more marginalized and blame them for the problems that men are facing? How can we try to have empathy for all the different issues that everybody is facing when it comes to gender? now that we've now that I've given you an idea of the problem of masculinity in terms of how men are affected by it, how they can affect other people, and how we struggle as a society to talk about it, let's keep defining our terms a little bit. We haven't yet really given a definition of masculinity or femininity. Well, what do we mean by these terms? I think in a very general way, we think of masculinity, and again, this depends on individual people's cultural backgrounds and points in history that they live in, and we'll get more into that. But in a very general way, we think of masculinity as a set of traits and characteristics for how men are supposed to be, how they're supposed to act. To be a man, to be masculine means you are physically strong, you're assertive, you're direct, you value independence and autonomy. And that's often contrasted with femininity. So if men are supposed to be emotionally stoic and keep a lot of their emotions in and not show it, women are emotionally expressive. They're supposed to be more cooperative than competitive, etc. Now, of course, when we read a list of these types of traits, you'll notice that, well, every single individual person could display these traits and has all these characteristics and traits to some degree or not. Some men are very stoic and strive to be and not show a lot of emotions. Other men are very nurturing and very cooperative and emotionally expressive, and vice versa. So I think you see, this doesn't really tell us anything unique about what it means to be masculine or feminine. And of course, this traditional way that we talk about masculinity and femininity is very binary, right? It's very much either one or the other. And so, of course, it inevitably leaves out a lot of people in society, people who are born intersex, people who don't even biologically neatly fit into one sex category or the other, as well as people who have alternate gender identities who don't necessarily say, yes, I completely align with what is thought of as masculine or what is thought of as feminine. So, because of that, I think we need another concept. We need another theory to help make sense of this. So, now I'm going to introduce the idea of hegemonic masculinity. So, hegemonic masculinity, according to Jody O'Brien, is a gender performance. That's what it represents. A gender performance implies that gender is not something innate, it's not tied to sex characteristics and biology, but rather it's a set of expectations held by society and its citizens. It's a set of actions by individuals and institutions. The performance of individuals is measured against the hegemonic masculine ideal. All gendered beings, all people, can police and shame each other's gender behavior performances. But those in the dominant position in society are the ones most expected to police other people's gender. So, what does this mean? So, this is another common way of talking about gender for people who talk about gender in this more cultural or social constructionist viewpoint. Gender as a performance. You might be thinking, well, does that imply that gender is something that's fake? Does a performance mean you're lying, you're being deceptive, you're not being honest? And no, that's not really what we mean. What we mean is the expectations people have of those different roles. So think of the idea of how we all have different roles in our lives. So in my life, if you think about, I perform different roles. I'm a father. That's a role that I perform. When you're a parent, when you're a father, there's certain expectations for how you're supposed to act. You expect that other people are expecting you to act a certain way. I know that my wife and my son expect me to act in a certain way. When I am at work, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, and you as a student, those are both different roles, right? Each of those roles bring with them expectations for how you're supposed to present yourself, how you're supposed to perform and act, the things you're supposed to say or not say. And so that's the type of logic then that we're applying to gender. In other words, masculinity isn't really an inherent essence as much as it is expectations for how you're supposed to act. Femininity is expectations for how you're supposed to act as a woman, how you're supposed to present yourself. So hegemonic masculinity then represents the masculine norms and the dominant ways of being a man in a given society at a given time. And that last part of the sentence there is key because what it's saying is based on your cultural context, based on your environment, based on the point in history and the type of society that you live in, that's going to bring with it potentially different expectations for what it means to be a man. What it means to be masculine has not meant the same thing throughout human history, both in terms whether that means how you're supposed to look or present to yourself or the types of traits that you idealize. So this is a concept coined by the sociologist Raywin Connell in the late 1980s. And again, this is a perspective that says gender is something that is that set of expectations or symbols that we have, and it's created through culture. It's created through communication and how we interact with each other and our expectations, as opposed to just being something that's reducible to a product of biology. And importantly, this is a perspective which claims so hegemonic masculinity is this ideal that nobody can really live up to. Nobody can ever really 100% match that ideal. Yet that ideal is something we are measuring ourselves against and also measuring other people against. And so, what are the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity? Well, as we just said, to some extent, the answer to that is well, it depends on what cultural background you're from and when you're living in history. In general, though, hegemonic masculinity is associated with a few things. So, number one, the ideal man in culture is straight, heterosexual. The ideal man is muscular. The ideal man is stoic. Stoicism is many different schools of thought and philosophy, but basically what we mean is how stoicism has been interpreted here just to mean like not showing a lot of emotions, not letting your emotions overwhelm you, kind of just being like, yeah, not letting a lot of things in your life bother you and trying to seem cool and unbothered by things. It can involve risk taking, political strength, and then lots of other characteristics. However, I want to stress how this has changed throughout history a little bit. I promise this is about God of War, by the way. I know this is a lot of talk about gender and gender studies and masculinity. I promise me going over all this stuff is going to help you understand my analysis of God of War. So we're going to get back to it. So, according to the historical sociologist Michael Kimmel, throughout history, there has been different gender crises or crises of, in this case, masculinity. And so in his book, Manhood in America, really classic book, very interesting, he goes all the way back to the dawn of America, the dawn of the United States. And he talks about the type of lives that men and their families lived in and how the interestingly, how the economic arrangements of the society and the social political arrangements led to different, he calls them archetypes of being a man. And so he talks about this idea of a crisis of masculinity. And what this means is whenever a society goes through massive periods of change, whether that's economic change, my light went off again. Economic change, a new political system, new technologies are created. Well, that leads to disruption. It leads to social turbulence. It leads to people having to change how they lead their lives, what type of jobs they have, how much time and how they interact with their families. And the idea is when people go through those periods of crisis, that also leads to or can lead to identity crisis. How we understand ourselves can change and does change as well, including masculinity. He looks at this in early America. He also looks at this during the 1950s. So here's a few interesting points, I think, from Michael Kimmel. He claims that in early America, before the Industrial Revolution, before the dawn of American capitalism and the rise of businesses and entrepreneurship, we were a much more role-based society. So kind of pre-individualism. And that fact that so before this rise of the ideology of individualism, that came with it a different set of social relations. So one interesting thing that Michael Kimmel notes is the term masculinity itself doesn't really exist before the 15th century in terms of a way that people begin talking about gender, people talking about being a man. Instead, there's this different idea of manliness. Now, you might hear those terms and think, well, that sounds like it means the same thing, manliness, masculinity. But according to Michael Kimmel and other people, other scholars in this area, they mean starkly different things. So, manliness would have been more of the predominant idea for men in early America. And what made you manly, what made you a man, was much more about the transition from being a child to being an adult. It was much more, manliness was much more about your roles in your family or in your community, your role as a father, your role as a husband, or what role you played in your community. So for a lot of men in early America, most of them were either farmers or artisans, or they had a trade of some sorts. Maybe they were a blacksmith and their father before them was a blacksmith and his father before him was a blacksmith. And that led to a certain sort of social stability, but also that reflects a society that predates individualism and that need to kind of create who you are and define who you are. Now, Michael Kimmel argues with the rise of industrialization, with the rise of the business class, comes with it the rise of the idea of the self-made man. So if you're a man living through industrialization in America, well, one thing that's happening is if you had been a farmer for generations, a lot of times you are losing access to that. You're not a farmer anymore. And because more people, more men are now able to start a business and create a business, again, that leads to this new idea for identity, which is you define who you are. You need to define who you are as a man. The other important shift that Michael Kimmel argues happens here is where manliness was something that was verified more through your relationship with your family, your community. Masculinity now becomes something that is verified from other men. In other words, the way you can verify for yourself that you're masculine is you need other men to see you as masculine. So this is represented with different ideas, sometimes the idea of the homosocial bond. In other words, men are performing masculinity specifically for each other, not so much for women or not so much for their families, but they need other men to see that they are living up to the masculine ideal for them to feel secure in their sense of self. Okay, well, how does this idea of crisis of masculinity then apply to the modern day? So there's an interesting book series, edited scholarly book series that I've contributed to, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So, two different books that have been edited by a scholar named Donalyn Pomper. So, a first one that she wrote called Rhetoric of Femininity, and then a second one which I and some of my colleagues contributed to called The Rhetoric of Masculinity. So I wrote a book chapter for that book, The Rhetoric of Masculinity, from a rhetorical perspective, where we used a theory called gender role stress and conflict, which is a theory from social psychology, and we analyzed how different YouTube influencers talk about this crisis of masculinity. So, something that I'm interested in my research is how social media and social media influencers shape identity and how people understand themselves and how they make different arguments to people about how they need to act as men or women or as their gender, etc. And so in our chapter, we had that focus of how does media and social media engage with men's mental health and how do these different influencers, so we looked at these three, and their different YouTube channel names are Charisma on Command, ContraPoints, and then Elliot Hulse. That's from left to right. And we argued in our chapter that each of these different influencers, and obviously lots more, they have different stories of what they think the crisis is in society right now and different competing solutions to the question of how to be a man or how should men act. And then that's already been a few years ago. If I think of even more recent examples of that reflect this concept of the crisis of masculinity, you might recognize some of these things that have happened in pop culture more recently. So, lots of different figures related to what is called the manosphere. So, the manosphere is a term which has been used to talk about different things on internet culture for years now. It has really officially entered the mainstream, though, with this Netflix documentary that came out earlier this year by Louis Theroux called Inside the Manosphere, where he talks to basically a bunch of Andrew Tate manosphere aligned figures who all have slightly different branding, but to different extents represent what we could call manosphere or incel ideology, which often is basically beliefs that men are under attack in society and women or the political left or people who are marginalized are to blame for that. And basically advocating that men need to act in very hegemonically masculine ways. So, Inside the Manosphere, interesting documentary that shows this is an important thing in culture right now. And then this other figure who I'm sure some of you have heard of, Clavicular. So Clavicular, who is this streamer who has been mainstreaming a lot of things related to incel ideology and looks maxing, right? A lot of these ideologies, which basically say, look, if there is a clear hierarchy in society, and some men, maybe biologically because of their genetics, they're destined to be at the top of the hierarchy, and there's a lot of other men who are destined to be forever alone, except, maybe they can smash their face with a hammer, and if they do that enough and change their skull shape and their jaw size, then maybe women will go out with them. And something interesting I learned about Clavicular is, and this connects to that idea of stoicism and hegemonic masculinity. I saw a video where he said that he tries to say, I think, less than 100 words per day. I guess to preserve his masculine energy or something. And again, that's reflective of that ideal of stoicism. It's, oh, well, to be a man, I don't need to talk too much. I don't need to express myself or express my emotions too much. So I need to be disciplined and only say less than 100 words per day. Well, all these different figures like Clavicular or these people in the Manosphere documentary, they are people who are trying to capitalize on what we can think of as this modern crisis of masculinity, where the modern social media and political and economic context we live in and turbulence has created a lot of identity conflict and a lot of cultural strife over how we talk about all these things. And so, like I mentioned, in that book chapter that I wrote, we use this theory, gender role stress conflict, which in a nutshell basically says men, women, all of us with our gender identities, we are all constantly measuring ourselves against different expectations for how to act, different ideals. And of course, we inevitably don't live up to those ideals. And when we don't, that causes psychological stress. It causes psychological stress on ourselves, as well as it can have negative effects on how we interact with other people. So, four stressors or four dimensions of gender stress people can experience are: one, issues with trying to achieve success, power, and competition. Another issue would be restricted emotionality. So, for men, being able to express a wide range of emotions beyond anger. Another stressor would be restricted affection between men. So men being able to be intimate and affectionate with each other, with other men, with their male friends or with their male family members. And then also how conflicts can emerge between men's work lives and careers and family lives, and how gender expectations play into that. Okay, we are finally going to talk about God of War. I told you I promised this video is about God of War. So I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, you know a little bit about the God of War games. There will be some spoilers that I'm going to be going over. And I also would encourage you to just, maybe look up a synopsis of the game series, because I'm not going to do a full overview. But I will be citing some from not the Lomas article, but the Wingo article, the other assigned scholarly article that you had this week that was actually analyzing God of War Ragnarok. So now that we gave you all of that theoretical context around gender, let's get ready to apply that to God of War. So, God of War is a video game series originally through PlayStation, and it was originally in the early 2000s. And in a nutshell, it's about this main character named Kratos and Kratos' relationship with the Greek gods, the Greek pantheon. So Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Ares, Athena, etc. And so there was that original series of games, and then the series was rebooted in 2018 for the two most recent games. So God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok. And basically, what you need to know about the first series of games is basically a bunch of things happen to Kratos, and he goes after revenge, and he ends up killing a lot of the Greek gods or killing the Greek pantheon. So he's often perceived in culture as this very angry character. He had some really bad things happen to him, and so he went on this really bloody revenge streak against the Greek gods. And then in the Norse games, he has found himself in the Norse saga, so the Norse pantheon, so Thor and Odin, etc. And he's much older, and he's trying to really just trying to like find peace and solace. But then we'll get to that other game in a second. But according to this Wingo article, Kratos' depiction, so his depiction as a male character, is one of a bare chested, overly muscular warrior with a penchant for raging and violent outbursts, marking him as the very poster child for the hyper masculine male protagonist in gaming. And so, if we're thinking about how masculinity has been represented in video games and gaming culture, Kratos is definitely one of those characters that would come to our mind in terms of embodying that very hyper masculine ideal. And if not all, at least some of those aspects of hegemonic masculinity, for better or for worse. So that was the perception of the character in the first series of games, this very angry, very violent, very hyper masculine character. Well, as I mentioned, the more recent games rebooted the character and took him in a different direction. So, in the Norse saga now, in the most recent games, Kratos is still a badass, right? He's still this extremely powerful warrior, capable god killer like he was in the Greek games, but he's more subdued. He is at a different place in his life. He now has a son named Atreus. He had, or at least at the start of one of the games, he had a wife, so he's got a family. And in his older years, he definitely seems like a much more reflective, contemplative character. But throughout the games, you see that he is struggling still with his past. He's still struggling with learning how to be a caring, affectionate father, right? And to have a healthy interaction, a healthy relationship with his son. So he's still kind of haunted by the ghost of his past, if you want to think about it from that standpoint. And also, again, spoiler alerts, but if you haven't played the game, when they rebooted it, so in God of War 2018, the first Norse Saga game, the game literally starts with Kratos' wife, Faye, them doing a burial for her, doing a ceremony for her. And So it starts with him losing his wife, and it's really emotional, and you can see that he's now a single parent. He's now going to have to figure out how to be a father on his own. And that's part of his journey throughout the games, is trying to figure out how to do that, how to be a good father, how to do that in a healthy way. Okay, so we're going to let me pause this for a second. So next I'm going to be showing you a couple different video clips, both from God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok, and I want to use those to illustrate some of those different ideas around masculinity that I was talking about. So first, let's watch this one.
Brother, what exactly do you intend to ask the Norns?
How I may find my son. Nothing more.
You don't imagine it's a chance to clear up all this mess about prophecy? Perhaps get a second opinion on your alleged demise.
You didn't tell me you had a death prophecy?
When Atreus and I reached Jotunheim, we found a hidden mural. The giants, Faye herself, had foreseen our entire journey long ago. Who we would meet, who we would fight. All of it, as it happened.
But you aren't dead.
That image was from a time yet to come.
I see. You've never struck me as someone who fears death. That's not the problem, is it?
No. Death can have me when it earns me.
Then maybe it's not the future that bothers you. Faye sent you on your journey, and she made sure you'd see that image at the end of it. And you're still not sure why.
I wish to speak of this no further.
So first off, I wanted to use that particular clip because that quote from Kratos is so great, isn't it? And Christopher Judge, the actor, his super deep voice, the "death can have me when it earns me." I can't do the voice, of course, as deep, but the other thing that I thought was interesting about that clip was this theme in God of War Ragnarok of prophecy and destiny. It's a big part of Kratos' character arc in these games is him feeling like a monster, right? He's haunted by his past where he was so violent, and he's so worried about that now because now he has this son that he's trying to be a good dad to and, not be violent towards. And so he's struggling with this part of his identity, his nature. He's like, I'm a god and I'm a monster and I'm also a man and I'm also human. And I can't help but think of the discussion of prophecy and that theme of prophecy and Kratos sort of rubbing against it in this game as a metaphor for masculinity. And another thing that's interesting is I started this lecture today with that quote from Bell Hooks about the idea of a mask being in the word masculinity. I can't help but notice in God of War Ragnarok, there's a mask that's a really important part of the story as well. So Odin, who is the main antagonist of God of War Ragnarok, he's really trying to find and use this mask. He's obsessed with using this mask that you can see Kratos' son Atreus holding over here, and he's trying to use Atreus and Atreus's powers to find this mask and to put it together and to use it, basically because he thinks the mask can. I don't need to get into the spoilers too much, but he thinks the mask will give him answers to to the big questions that he has in life. Like, what is his purpose in life? It's really interesting because you have this character who's a god, right? The god Odin, and he's like having an existential crisis almost. And I do think it's interesting though, because the game doesn't really give us any resolution with that. The mask never goes anywhere. He's never able to really use it to get any answers. And I can't help but think of that as a metaphor for masculinity, right? Like there is no inherent essence to what it means to be a man, but people have this ideal of it. And I can't help but think of this idea of prophecy that in God of War, Kratos has constantly struggled against prophecies and are the prophecies that are dooming him or destining him to have to act a certain way. Like, oh, it's just destiny that I have to act a certain way. It's destiny that I have to go and fight this person, and it's inevitable that I'm going to die, or inevitable that they're going to die, or it's inevitable that my son is going to die, and how that can cause so much fear for Kratos. This is one of the most interesting things that I love about this game, is what the Norse Saga games did with the character and are doing of Kratos. In the original games, Kratos is the ultimate badass. He's the ultimate god killer. He killed gods, he killed titans. How do you take a character like that and then make them interesting? Like, how do you make them vulnerable? How do you make them vulnerable and in need of personal growth? Turn them into a parent. Take the ultimate badass, make him a parent, put him in a new context and environment where now he has to deal with other emotions like fear. And so that's the first thing, is this idea of prophecy as a metaphor for masculinity. And again, sometimes people do feel destined to have to act a certain way, that I'm a man, so I'm not allowed to show my emotions. I'm a man, I have to do this. I have to prove to other men that I'm good at whatever this thing is. Well, no, not necessarily, but that is something that can affect us. Okay. Something else that this makes me think of, this idea of masculinity is something that is prophesied, that people are destined to have to do a certain way. There's another really famous book amongst men's rights activists called Iron John that the author Robert Bly wrote in the 1990s, where he argues that men in the modern world have become disconnected from this ancient mythical ideal of masculinity, and that there needs to be some sort of return to that. And while I do find Iron John to be an interesting book to read, I do think that there's some interesting points, some valuable points there. This is more broadly reflecting what I don't think is true, this erroneous idea that there is this internal mythical essence of masculinity that has been accessible to men all throughout history, and that we need to return to some past era of society. So I do think that there's an interesting connection to be made there. But I want to move on and show you some other clips that I think illustrate that idea of restrictive emotionality.
Your knife. No. Finish what you started.
I can't. I...
It won't let me move on to my next clip. 2 seconds. Okay, so I love that clip. So that clip is from not Ragnarok, but God of War 2018, so the first of the reboot series. And just for a little context, that's a scene that happens early on in the game where right after Kratos and Atreus have buried his wife Faye, they go hunting. And I think there's a couple interesting things that are happening in that scene from the hegemonic masculinity standpoint. So first off, Atreus, his son, is clearly uncomfortable. He clearly doesn't want to have to kill that deer. He was kind of okay with going to hunt it, but then when Kratos is like, "No, you need to finish the job. You need to kill it with your knife," he clearly doesn't want to have to do that. Now, another aspect, another characteristic of hegemonic masculinity, which I haven't talked about yet, is sometimes called frontiersmanship. And this is basically the idea that to be a man, you need to be able to conquer nature in the outdoors. You need to have a mastery of like outdoor skill sets, which might include things like hunting. And that doesn't mean that, obviously hunting can be a very valuable skill and it's a necessity for people sometimes. But the point is, boys and men can be socialized into, and that's an aspect of hegemonic masculinity that boys are often socialized into, and any sort of emotional distress or hesitancy that they have about that can be ignored or brushed aside. It's like, no, you need to be a man. You need to man up and get over it and just kill this deer, even if it's making you upset. I mean, it makes me think about when I, when I was a kid. I remember with my grandfather having to we killed a muskrat and I had to skin it, right? And it was a whole ritual. He made me skin the muskrat. And for any of you that have ever been a kid having to skin an animal, especially when you're really young, it's gross, it's traumatizing, it's really distressing, and there was really no sort of checking in on that, right? There wasn't any sort of discussion about it. So I think you see hegemonic masculinity with Atreus, and you also see it, of course, with Kratos. I love that visual storytelling that you see where right after they kill the deer and Kratos knows that Atreus is upset by it, and you can tell that, or I think it's clear that Kratos thinks that he has to do it, right? He's like, even if Atreus is upset, he has to do it because he's afraid. He's scared for his son. He's afraid. He's like, I have to teach Atreus to be self-reliant. I might get killed or I might die. I'm not always going to be around for him. So I have to force him to do this thing that makes him upset. And that camera shot where we see Kratos, he almost goes to put his hand on Atreus' shoulder, but he stops, right? Atreus doesn't see it, but we as the player, we as the audience see that. I think that's such brilliant storytelling. And it illustrates that idea of restrictive emotionality in men, right? Kratos, he wanted to comfort Atreus. He wanted to console him. He wanted to put that hand on his shoulder and be like, "It's okay, son," right? Like it's okay that you're upset that we had to kill this deer, but but we had to. But he doesn't. He doesn't do that, and that's restrictive emotionality. That's Kratos's own. I interpret that as Kratos struggling against that masculine ideal. It's like, no, I have to be a good dad. I have to be strong. I have to teach him self-reliance. And so because of that, I can't show that emotion to him right now. It's going to make him weak. Love that clip. Let's watch another one that I think illustrates this idea of men struggling to express a range of emotions. After the ad.
They're still scared.
Not of the raiders. Do not be afraid. You are safe. Good. Good boys.
Yes.
Good girls.
Okay, so let's analyze that scene. Let's break that down a little bit. Again, for context, if you have not played the games before, this scene is the culmination. It's the end of a side quest that you can do in God of War Ragnarok, where basically you have to go around to all these different places and using the wolves, right? Using his two wolves, they take you to all these different locations and you have to defeat all these raiders, okay? I love this. I loved this moment when I played the game because the game gives you an entire achievement for finally, being willing to show some affection to your wolves and you pet the wolves, right? I mean, this is a joke, right? This is a meme in culture about super rigid hyper masculinity as men not being able to show their emotions, restricted emotionality. But I do think this is a really poignant moment in the game where before the end of this quest line, Kratos is very kind of cold. He's very cold and distant towards the wolves. He's very utilitarian and transactional towards them. They're really really just using them as a means to an end. And then finally he decides to he notices, he's like, oh no, like the wolves are scared, and so he goes to give them some affection. But notice how awkward he was with that, right? He was so awkward. He was so hesitant to show that emotion to the wolves, and he didn't even know their gender. He just assumed they were boys, and I love it. Freya is just like, they're girls. How do you not know that your wolves are girls? And so I think that's another interesting example, kind of funny example in the game of restrictive emotionality and how men sometimes hegemonic masculinity can demand that. Let's look at one more example that's going to touch on that same theme, and then this is going to get us into some more of the conflict between the relationship between Kratos and Atreus. This next clip's a little bit long, but it's good.
It's okay, boy. You're okay. I know. I missed you too. Where's your food? Still hungry? Come on, boy. You need to eat. Eat. Why? Too big? There you go. Good boy.
Atreus, the time draws near. You must prepare yourself.
For what? He's still eating. He wants to live.
He is dying.
You're a good boy. A brave boy. Fast and strong. But you can rest now. Okay? I'll be okay. You can let go now. You have to let go. Sofna. Afra. Tesu. Sofna. Hethon. Sofna. Sofna. Sofna.
I love the soundtrack so much in these games.
Come. We train.
What? No. It's the middle of the night.
Night does not stop our enemies.
Why? What for? Training is all we ever do, ever. It's not enough. We can't hide forever.
We do not hide. We prepare for a fight for which we are not ready. We'll go.
Time is running out. The prophecies say Fimbulwinter leads to Ragnarök. War is coming. Whatever Loki's supposed to be doing, he's supposed to be doing it now. My story doesn't end hiding in these woods. I should be out there, finding out who I am, who Loki is.
I will not allow you to pick a fight with gods.
I don't want to fight anyone. I just want answers.
And if those answers lead to war with Asgard?
Maybe that's what Mother wanted.
You do not know what Mother wanted.
Looks like we never will. Look. Can I have a moment alone with Fenrir before I bury him?
That game is so good. It makes me want to start another playthrough. Let's break that scene down a little bit. A lot of different interesting things happening in that scene in terms of the relationship between and the conflict you can see happening, emerging between Kratos and Atreus. One thought I had was to apply relational dialectics theory to this scene. So I know at least some of you are communication majors. Maybe you've talked about this theory in communication theory if you've taken that class before. If not, I'll just briefly explain it. So basically, relational dialectics theory is a core theory and perspective in interpersonal communication. And basically, its thesis is that the driving force of relationships is differences between people and the interplay between differences, and basically how people cope in relationships with having contradictory needs and desires and perspectives. And so the central idea is that when we're in close relationships with other people, we experience what the theory calls dialectical tensions within ourselves and within our interactions. And those often can revolve around contradictory needs and emotional desires that we have. So, for example, some common dialectical tensions we could think of would be openness versus protection or autonomy versus connection, right? Well, what does that mean? That means when you're in a relationship with someone, on the one hand, you have the desire or the need to be open with them, to share things about yourself. At the same time, you want to guard your information and decide what's private and hidden and what you want people to know about you or not. Or autonomy versus connection. What does this one mean? Well, this one means in our close relationships, on the one hand, we all have that desire for autonomy and independence. We want to be able to do our own thing. We want to be able to make decisions on our own, maybe spend time on our own, and not have other people tell us what to do. At the same time, the whole point of being in a relationship is to be connected with other people, right? And so that you could see how those are contradictions. Those are forces and needs that contradict each other, and we're constantly finding ourselves in our relationships kind of caught between them and being tugged in opposite directions. And I think we can see Kratos and Atreus experiencing probably a range of these. So, for example, openness versus protection. We can see from that clip, and more if you've played the game, Kratos is trying to protect himself. He's trying to protect himself and protect Atreus. He is probably to some extent scared of Thor and Odin, who are the main antagonists of the game, especially because he has found himself in a foreign land, right? He's not in his homeland. And also not because he can't protect himself as much as he's afraid for Atreus. So he's very much on the protection. Like, no, let's kind of stay here. Let's stay hidden. Let's focus on training so we can prepare. Atreus, like, someone his age, he's a teenager. He's an adolescent. He's a little bit older in God of War Ragnarok. And he's trying to figure out who he is. Atreus wants to go out and explore and adventure in the world more. He wants to learn more about himself. He's got this really interesting, part of his identity that he's discovered that he might be Loki, right? And so that he wants to discover more of who he is. At the same time, back on the protection side of things, Kratos throughout these games, especially in 2018, he's very guarded about his past. He doesn't want Atreus to know about his past in the Greek pantheon, and all the violence that he committed, et cetera, because he feels like he's a monster. So they're kind of in tension with each other there. At the same time, we can see autonomy versus connection. So Kratos is really worried about Atreus, and because of that, they fight with each other for Atreus's independence. Kratos wants that independence for Atreus eventually because he's afraid someday he's not going to be able to take care of them. That's a very common thing parents feel towards their children. However, because of that, he's kind of constricting Atreus a lot, right? He's not letting him go off and do his own thing. Because of that, Atreus is often kind of sneaking off, and he's going and exploring with this other character, Sindri. And then he ends up lying to Kratos about that, and that creates a conflict later on. We also see in that scene we just watched the two different characters processing grief maybe in slightly different ways. So Atreus asks him, "Hey, can I have a moment with Fenrir, the wolf? Can you let me be by myself to grieve?" Well, that's a very common aspect of hegemonic masculinity, is men feeling like when they're grieving or going through something really emotional, that's not something you're supposed to do around other people. That's something you do in private. And not just men, right? That's something that I think women are sometimes socialized into doing as well. To not be a burden on other people. I'm not going to cry in front of my dad. My dad's going to think I'm weak if I cry in front of him. And so Kratos gives Atreus that space because he thinks he probably is agreeing. He's like, yeah, well, good. You need to be by yourself to grieve him. And that's tricky because maybe that is what Atreus needed in that moment. Sometimes we all need that moment by ourselves. At the same time, maybe it would have been nice for him to be able to feel like he can openly express his grief with someone else, with his father. So that's going to move us into a little bit more of analyzing God of War Ragnarok. And here I'm going to pull on the analysis that the Wingo article talks about. So I think this is a really cool analysis that they did. This article, one of their examples they use is a boss battle from God of War Ragnarok, where you playing as Kratos and you have Atreus helping you, you fight Garm. You're fighting this, as you can see in this picture, you're fighting this giant and immortal, super deadly wolf. And basically, Kratos and Atreus, it's a really good boss fight, by the way. If you haven't played the game, it's really fun. But they end up having a relational conflict over it. Let me read you this quote. So to quote Wingo, Kratos' dialogue during this battle shows that he wants Atreus to stay away, stay safe, and survive above all else. He's focused primarily on protecting his son. However, Atreus is arguing that he can help. He wants to help out, and that they should try his way of resolving the problem, and so on. This battle forces Kratos to accept that he is failing and that he must trust his son. So to give you a little bit more context, again, if you haven't played the game, because the article doesn't really explain this, what they're disagreeing about here is how to go about handling this giant wolf Garm. Kratos is basically like, we need to kill this thing, right? So old school Kratos, let's kill this thing. And Atreus is disagreeing and saying, no, I don't think we have to. I think, let me use my magic or whatever. I think we could befriend the wolf and like calm it down. Like you give like in Minecraft when you give the wolf the bone, right? And it becomes your friend. And what's interesting is, so they try it Kratos' way, right? They kill it, and in this boss battle, you're fighting Garm, you're chipping away at its health. But it turns out this thing is immortal, and nothing they're doing is working. And that's why Kratos is basically forced to be like, okay, I need to trust my son. I need to respect his opinion and be like, my way doesn't always have to be the way of doing things. And this is something that fathers and sons, parents and children can struggle with, right? Especially as you as the child, as you get older, parents can really struggle with learning how to know when to respect their child's opinion. Let's look at a couple more examples. So I think that boss fight was a really interesting example of that kind of conflict playing out. Another relationship that Kratos has in this series, I think, is really illuminating. So again, to quote Wingo, Through his time with Freya, Kratos eventually begins to understand that he must eventually let go of his son. Here, Freya acts as a catalyst. She is a character whose complete and total refusal to let go of her own son, Baldur, led to his death, her son's death in the previous God of War 2018 game. By traveling and fighting alongside Freya, Kratos sees the long-term ramifications of overly sheltering his own son. So to give you a little bit of background on this, in God of War 2018, Freya is a side character who she ends up helping Kratos and Atreus out, and she's really important to the ending of 2018. So in the 2018 game, her son Baldur is the main antagonist, and the story basically goes that Freya was really afraid of she was scared for her son, and so she put an enchantment, or he would see it as a curse on him that made him immortal and invulnerable. So Baldur he's unable to be killed, but also because of that, he was unable to feel anything like physical sensation, and because of that, that led to him hating his mother because he felt like she took that away from him. And so at the end of 2018, Baldur basically wants revenge on Freya and he tries to kill her. And Freya is just like, yes, like, I'll let you kill me. That's fine. I understand that I've hurt you. And Kratos is the one that steps in and stops Baldur. He stops him from killing Freya. And he's like, no, the cycle ends here. The cycle of violence ends here. And he ends up killing Baldur. And so the end of 2018 is really like, you're thinking Freya now wants revenge on Kratos. That's what she tells him. She's like, I'm going to ruin you for this. You've taken my son from me. I'm going to kill you and your son. However, they have an interesting relationship arc in God of War Ragnarok where while they certainly start off as enemies, adversaries, they eventually travel together, become companions, even friends. And it's interesting that Kratos ends up learning from Freya and honestly kind of learning from her mistakes and also respecting her experience as a parent and how that informs his own relationship with Atreus. That point brings me to one of the final points I wanted to talk about, which is this idea of ludonarrativity. So here's a point I'm actually going to draw from video game studies a little bit because I think this is really interesting. So in game studies, there's this concept, if you're unfamiliar, called ludonarrativity. And it's basically how people study the relationship between the story in a game and the mechanics of the game, the actual gameplay. And here's something that I noticed when I played God of War Ragnarok. Well, of course, the story of a game and the gameplay, they can either complement each other and synergize, right? Or they can kind of contradict each other. And in both ways, that can do some interesting things in the game. One thing that I noticed is when you play God of War Ragnarok, of course, you're mostly playing as Kratos. Sometimes you play as Atreus. But when you play as Kratos, you almost always have supporting characters in the combat. So it's a very combat-driven game, and you almost always have at least Atreus who can jump in and help you by like shooting arrows at enemies, or Freya. However, there's certain points in the game where the game actually takes that ability away from you. Now, I think from the standpoint of the game designers, I think they probably just do this to make those levels a little bit harder or just to shake things up a little bit. But I also think there's some ludonarrativity going on because when you play the game, you get so used to having that help, right? Like you get so used to doing your combos and attacking and parrying, and also like a button that you hit to get those like supporting moves from Freya and Atreus. And so when they take that away from you and it's just Kratos fighting by himself without his support, it throws you off. It throws off your entire rhythm. It makes the combat way harder. And I think that's an interesting way of kind of reinforcing this narrative point, which is Kratos learning to lean on other people. Kratos learning to learn from Freya's mistakes. Kratos learning to trust and respect Atreus, even though he is the dad, even though he's the experienced one, even though he's so afraid for Atreus that he's trying to protect him, right? Kratos is always struggling against that aspect of hegemonic masculinity, which says, you as the dad, you as the man, you have to be the protector. You have to be the one who kills the boss, right? You have to be the one. No, let the women and the children stay aside. Freya, Atreus, I got it. Kratos has to learn that sometimes even the ultimate badass needs help. Even the ultimate badass, sometimes the ultimate badass's plan doesn't work out, right? And that's okay. So I think that is some interesting ludo narrative synergy going on. There's probably other examples of that as well. And what that example makes me think of is another great quote from Bell Hooks, the author. Healing does not take place in isolation. I love this quote because when it comes to Kratos in God of War, in some ways he is trying to heal from his past still. He's trying to heal from all the violence he committed. And while he's still a badass and he's still very capable in the games, what we see him going through in the games is learning that he doesn't have to do all that processing and emotional work by himself. He doesn't have to compartmentalize and hide his past or every aspect of it from his son and from Freya. He can talk about those things some. He can lean on the other people in his life and learn from them and share those things, and that actually learning from other people in his life is what's going to help him heal into being a more whole version of himself. All right, I know this has been a very long lecture, so let's talk about summarizing some main points and some takeaways from this. So, first off, I hope that I've made it clear to you today that gender expectations, expectations that we have for how we're supposed to act as a man or as a woman, etc., not only have those changed throughout history and the types of societies people lived in, but we have agency. We have some power to choose how we want to interact with other people and how we want to be compassionate to ourselves and how we relate to ourselves, even if we find ourselves rubbing up against those ideals of gender. And similarly, gender stress is something that affects us in our relationships and how we interact and communicate with other people, whether gender is something you ever think about or not. This is something I've realized in my own life. It's like, you might be the type of person who's like, I don't see the point of ever really thinking about gender, or I don't understand why it's something that people study. But I hope that I've shown you today that the ideals that we have for and the expectations that gender brings into communication, they really do affect us. No one can ever live up to whatever that ideal set of standards is to be the ideal man or woman. And, these questions that I posed at the start of today, how do we rescript a healthy masculinity for society? How can men and fathers and parents be better? Obviously, those are like super big questions that a lecture like this can't really answer. But what it does make me think of is, well, if anything, maybe some points we can think about is that healthy fathers and sons shouldn't compete with each other. They should collaborate. They should try to learn from each other. And whatever healthy masculinity needs to mean or can mean to people, I think maybe at the bare minimum, healthy masculinity should include a growth mindset and wanting to learn from other people and not feeling like you have to live up to every aspect of however you perceive the masculine ideal, and that you can learn from other men in your lives. You can learn from women in your lives. You can learn from people who don't fit traditional expectations for gender or gender performance. And so here's a last point I would leave you with. As I said, I started today's lecture with that quote from Bell Hooks, which implied the idea of a mask in masculinity, implying that idea of gender being something that's performed. In God of War Ragnarok, I do think that the mask that Odin is obsessed with finding, is a metaphor here for hegemonic masculinity. He's obsessed with this idea of, if we interpret the mask to mean masculinity, and he's obsessed with it and trying to pursue it and live up to it, and he thinks it's going to answer all of his questions. But I think, what if we asked a counter question, which is, what if there is no mystery behind the mask of masculinity? What if it doesn't actually really mean anything? What would that leave us with? Well, I think all that would really leave us with is the choice. How are we going to choose how to relate to each other? How are we going to choose to be a man or a woman? And how are we going to choose how to communicate with each other in our relationships? And lastly, let's talk about your first essay, which I'm titling Reimagining Relationships. Let me read through it and talk about it a little bit. So, rationale: video games, through their stories, characters, gameplay, and other mechanics, can influence how we feel about and communicate in our relationships. For example, as I've talked about in this lecture today, God of War Ragnarok asks us to reconsider what a healthy father son or parent child relationship looks like, or asks us to think about something like healthy, positive masculinity. So, what do I want you to do in this paper? Well, I want you to choose a game and write about a relationship in it. Now, you could choose this game, the game of the week, God of War Ragnarok, or you could choose one of the other games that I have listed for the course. Or, and I would strongly consider you to encourage to consider doing this, you could choose a completely different game. A completely different game that you choose where you're going to analyze a particular relationship in it and how that game and how that relationship, how it prompts us to reflect on that type of relationship and maybe what a healthy version of that relationship can or should look like. So, just to give you one other example that comes to mind, last year I had a student write a really good paper on the game Red Dead Redemption 2, and they analyzed a relationship from that game that was kind of like a mentor mentee relationship. So it's pretty wide open in terms of what type of game and what games you can write about. I will say, as my instructions say, you do need to choose some type of game that has some story in it and that clearly has characters and relationships. So I know that's still pretty broad, but obviously video games are so broad that there's lots of video games that probably wouldn't, meet those qualifications. So you don't have to do some big AAA game like The Last of Us or, whatever, but you do, to be able to write the paper, you do need to choose a game that clearly has some story in it and has characters that have relationships and interactions with each other. And so here's the prompt. How does this game invite us to imagine this type of relationship? That's the basic premise and question you're going to answer. And you can answer that in a few different ways. You can maybe model how you answer that based on some of the things I did in the lecture today, right? So, analyzing the gameplay, analyzing the story, the themes of the story, analyzing the things, the dialogue itself between the moments or the conflicts between characters. And again, it could be different types of relationships. You could also explore this idea of parent child. You could explore romantic relationships more. You could explore friendships or family relationships. Even I don't potentially boss worker. I mean, there could be a couple different ways, but that is your goal. So you want to write this paper in APA 7 style. It needs to be an essay format. So you need to have a clear introduction with a body, multiple paragraphs where you are doing that analysis and walking me through that, and then a conclusion. It should be 4 to 6 pages, double spaced, not including a cover title page and a page for your references. You do need to use some research. So first off, whatever game you decide to use, God of War, something totally different, cite it in APA. Put it on both the references list at the end, and you should have some in-text citations for it. You should meaningfully cite that source and incorporate some other things. So I do want you to specifically use the reading from Adrian Shaw from the first week, which was talking about video games as cultural studies other. So I have it here for you again, and here's your citation. You can just copy and paste onto the references page. So I do want you to not just put it on the references list, but incorporate one or two ideas from her paper into your analysis of your game, right? That could be that idea of the indelible gamer, the stereotype of the gamer. That could be other ideas she had about what makes video games a unique medium. Incorporate that, though, to give your essay some more scholarly grounding. And then third, you do need at least one more credible or scholarly source. So that means you should have at least 3 sources on your references list. So number 1, the game you're using. Number 2, the Shaw article. And then number 3, another source of your choice. Maybe you find another scholarly article. You might find one that analyzes the actual video game that you're talking about. Or maybe you find like a journalism piece that talks about your video game or about gaming. You have some agency there, but you do need to incorporate, you need to find one other source that you think helps you make the points that you want to make to elaborate on your thesis in that paper. And so here, down here, you can also take a look at the rubric and read, this is how I will be grading and assessing these papers. And as always, let me know if you have any questions about this assignment. Have a good one.